You know, I think that this next, the discussions really have been fabulous, so thank you all for participating. And I believe that this next part of the discussion is probably going to be the most important, because we're talking about the steps moving forward. How do we overcome barriers to doing whatever it takes to eliminate loss of control in general aviation? So we'll just go around the room. I'd love to hear your comments. Now, you're probably thinking I'm going to start here or we're going to start here, but we're not. We're going to start right here in the middle. Now Patty, look, some people have their lives turned upside down. You have spent most of your life upside down. So, but there really is a difference between what you're doing, because you're doing it in a controlled environment, versus the VFR pilot that we're talking about that flies and loses control. But moving forward, based on all of your experience, aerobatic experience and as a flight instructor, what do you think we need to do to overcome this issue?
Well, I'm very excited about the technology and some of the things I've heard about today, and I think everything that we have and that we're going to get is fantastic. I know it reduces fatigue. Having traffic makes things safer. Having weather it's all changed my life. It took me years to get rid of my paper charts. It was, really difficult. Finally, I did because I'm kind of an old school pilot, but it's exciting, and I think pilots love it. A lot of pilots are gadget freaks. They love it, especially when it can make things safer. Most pilots want to be safe. I think most pilots have a pretty good level of maturity by the time they get their license. If they don't have it before they get their license, they have it after they do, which is a really good reason to fly. But and I'm sure you're not going to be surprised when I say that technology is not a substitute for basic stick and rudder skills, transferable skills that you can learn in any small airplane suited to upset training or aerobatic training. It's just not a substitute. We can use all these wonderful tools that we have and apps and everything, and I use all of them. But it's not a substitute. So we have to have good pilot skills. And I think of the Air France accident, which is the most visible accident that we've had in the last few years, and how sad it was that those pilots didn't have the training to recover from something that was quite recoverable from. And if they'd gone to fly, done some basic upset training recovery, they would have had those skills. And a lot of people would have been saved. I think having this kind of forum is fantastic, and knowing that so many people are on the same page as we are, as I am, and other people that I discuss this with. And I think if we don't get our act together, we're all going to be flying drones, and that scares me. So I think it's important for all the good pilots out there to know what resources are available and take advantage of those resources, and keep doing this kind of thing to make people more aware of what they need to do. Yeah.
So you mentioned upset recovery training, UPRT, upset prevention and recovery training. So I don't know if this is factual. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. That there is a difference between upset recovery training and aerobatic training. Somebody once said aerobatic training is a controlled maneuver.
Right. So learning loops, rolls, half Cuban 8s, things like that. I had a hard time with accepting upset recovery training at first. I've thought, if you know how to do aerobatics, there are no unusual attitudes, and you know how to recover from anything, because it's all embedded in the training. You learn about recovering if you stall at any angle, what to do, how to unload the wing. It's all about angle of attack and so on and so forth. But I also know that a lot of people think aerobatics is a little crazy and maybe a little dangerous and, a little frivolous maybe. And, I don't really want to do aerobatics, but I think more people do understand that they really do need some kind of training, and that's upset training. Upset training it's a very different, what we see in our schools, we see a very different group of people that come for upset training than we do for aerobatic training. The upset training people are often corporate or commercial pilots, sometimes Eclipse pilots, sometimes Gulfstream, sometimes airline. It's something they know they have to do, but they're not really looking forward to it. But after they do it and they understand that there's a very methodical way of teaching it, we're not just going to throw them into something, we're not trying to scare them, so on and so forth. They're really glad that they've taken this training. They enjoy it, they want to come back for more, and they tell people about it. And I think people are kind of blown away by how beneficial it was, because they were resistant to it. With aerobatic training, it's a different group that really wants to do it and also understands it's going to help them.
Thank you very much. So what we'll do is we'll sort of alternate from one side to the next. So Charlie, we'll go to you, and then Corey, you're next. So Charlie, what are your thoughts? What are the biggest challenges, or what challenges, and what are the next steps?
I think from a challenge standpoint, making people aware of how they understand the limitations that they have to deal with an airplane, and not to fear them but to respect them is a key component here. I think we haven't talked about it, but there's some things associated with type clubs. There are things you can do with social media. Most private pilots have spent their own money to get to where they are, and they don't want to be embarrassed publicly with either a lack of proficiency or lack of skill. But I found, I'll just give you a little anecdote. When I went through military flight school, I would sit in the briefing room, which was an open bay room with about 6 desks, one for each instructor and 3 students at each desk. And I eavesdropped on everything I could throughout the whole year of flight school. And I was learning from others so that I could minimize the number of times I'd embarrassed myself for not having learned it before I went and did it, right? So I think the culture is in need of encouraging pilots to take on what they fear and to get comfortable with it. So when someone doesn't want to take on aerobatics, there's a fear there. I'm going to get sick, I'm going to embarrass myself, I won't be able to do it. But fundamentally, airplane flying is a 3-dimensional sport. And if we teach people to fly around in airplanes in a 2-dimensional world, and they might as well be in a car. They need to really understand the 3 axes of motion of airplanes and be able to maneuver them in those 3 axes without fear and with confidence. And so the more we can encourage that, incentives are key to the culture. Somebody mentioned that CFIs don't want to spend a whole lot of extra time other than checking the block and moving up. What if airlines were to provide an incentive where not only have you met the minimums in terms of hours, but you also have to show for yourself that you've got so many hours in CFI and you've won a couple of awards as the outstanding instructor of a flight school or whatever. What if an airline gave a premium on hiring its pilots from those that have that incentive, have shown that they've taken that incentive on? What can we do culturally with incentives for pilots that have gone beyond the 3 takeoffs and landings in 90 days to actually feel like I'm going to go next time and get my 3 landings back with a guy in the right seat that can critique me on how I'm doing, rather than just go out solo and do it and then take his wife out. But what can we do to incentivize folks? So to me, there's a big thing going on here with culture.
Charlie, thank you very much. Corey.
Thank you, Robert. Challenge-wise, I think I may go a slightly different direction. I think we've seen, since 2014, we've seen some great trends in the accident numbers. I've had the opportunity to work with both CAST and GAGSC. CAST from its beginning, we just celebrated the 20th anniversary, and we saw the commercial accident fatality rate go down drastically. GAGSC started about the same time, like Sean mentioned. We rebooted in 2011. Taking the CAST approach, and we've seen a definite change in I think the accident, the trends that we've been monitoring every day. I think I think the challenge for us is to keep pressing to keep the change moving in the right direction. A lot of work has gone in. A lot of us at the table have been working these initiatives for quite some time. A lot of folks in the room here, and we never want to get to the point where we say, "Okay, we've done a lot. Let's stop." when we take a look at, I mean, and it's not just the technology things that we discussed today. It's even things as simple as outreach. We changed the way we conducted outreach through the GAGSC. So when I pick up a copy of AOPA Sport Pilot, or it's AOPA Pilot, EA Sport Pilot, FAA Safety Brief, or I go take in a fast team seminar, each month I'm seeing that same topic hit. So it's not just shotgunning a ton of different loss control or other topics out there. It's unifying as a community around a single topic and seeing that across. And I think that is helping a lot of folks really understand what are the risks out there, what are the things that I need to watch for in my own flying.
Thank you. And Sean, so you'll change the name of that magazine to EAA Professional Pilot, is that right? Never mind. You know.
Professional Sport Pilot.
There you go. There you go. I love it. Thanks. Thank you very much. Malcolm, what's on your mind?
Sure. So I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is differentiating between the tech and the technique. I think that's really around the table. Depending on the technology, too much can really be an issue. You know, we sort of were talking about the question from the audience, and we've talked a lot about keeping control in the pattern. But if we create so much tech that we will tell you with airspeed inputs and things like that, you're dropping airspeed, you might just start to rely on that. Like, I'm just going to fly until I get a buzz on my watch or something like that. So that there has to be mitigating factors in the culture. I mean, I'm going to steal your word. The other thing is not all technology is created equal. We have a synthetic vision product. We've had reports of people with full electronic failures getting home safely using synthetic vision only. While that warms my heart, it also makes me think I would not want someone doing that normally, because we're using ground track, we're using ground speed, we're using things like that. These are not driving off pedostatic systems, they're driving off of derived instruments. And so while I'm glad they're safe at night, I would not want someone to panel mount that thing in the middle, get rid of their six-pack and say, now I can use this to fly around. I think, as we were talking about earlier, continuing to encourage the community to self-assess. Getting back to the culture, this idea that we can start to provide in the technology things to assess your flights, assess your history of your flights, look for patterns, look for downward trends, hopefully encourage you when you see both upward and downward trends, potentially even gamification. I've had the top 10 landings at this airport or something like, some kind of social aspect there, things like that. And then also utilize the working groups and best practices. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that's going on in the FAA and these various working groups, there's the CFIT, there's the GCAS stuff, and things like that, and to start to incorporate the outcomes from these things that are starting to come to fruition. And then finally, just also on the bleeding edge, have the industry like Promora. I was really impressed, and would say continue to innovate, push the limits there, and then but also responsibly incorporate is the way I would think about that. Push the limits, but responsibly incorporate the new technology. So.
Thank you, Malcolm. Andrew.
Yeah, I seriously considered just my answer being get the Remora Systems product to market as soon as possible. But from a training perspective, I would love for every general aviation pilot to understand that pushing forward, reducing angle of attack is the critical step in stall recovery. And it's in the airplane flying handbook. The ACS says to do it properly. I think that could be maybe a little more prescriptive in telling DPEs exactly what they should look for and telling CFIs exactly what we should be teaching. So I think if we could just take that one piece of upset prevention recovery training, which is when the stall horn comes on, pushing the elevator forward, we'll fix it. If we can get that one piece out to every GA pilot, I think that would be huge.
So I had a student once that I demonstrated a stall to him and said, no, you just push forward, and it's his turn to do it. The next time we're both hanging on our shoulder harnesses, looking straight down. So I changed my vernacular to relax the back pressure.
Relax the back pressure. Move the elevator control input forward. Yeah, not too much, not excessively. We don't want to be hanging off of the seatbelts. But yeah,
Properly.
that one piece.
I did change my vernacular after that, but so Dave, you're next.
So I think the challenge is that there is no single solution, right? I mean, I think we need training to make the pilots feel connected with the airplane and to understand what the airplane is doing. At the same time, I will say that I think there is some technology solutions which may be beneficial out there. I agree with what Andrew just said. I think, the first two initial moves, when you're getting in trouble, relax the back pressure or push and add power. I have a cartoon up there that sort of is very simplistic, but I thought it would be comical. The analogy is driving a car and there's a cliff. The cliff being a stall at low altitude. The stall itself is not dangerous. The stall at low altitude is dangerous. Right now, we have one system on board, and that's the stall warning system required by regulation. I'm not advocating additional regulation for additional systems, but when you're driving a car and you're approaching a cliff, you have a series of signs. Warning, cliff ahead, next sign, slow down, then there's a stop sign, stop, cliff ahead. I guess what I'm saying is the stall warning might be too late. And perhaps if we back things up and look at some of the precursors to the stall and let the pilot feel connected with the airplane, perhaps we'll be more successful in the alerting piece. I put a deer on there. If you could go back to the slide for 1 second. I put a deer on there because that represents the startle factor. My son, he's now 17, but he was learning how to drive. And, when you learn how to drive, you understand the mechanics of driving a car down the road. You understand the laws and the rules, the equivalent of Part 91. But you don't really ever train for that dark night, unlit street, when the deer jumps out in front. That is the startle factor. What can we do to anticipate the startle factor and train to the startle factor so that it doesn't happen when you're at low altitude with fatal results? That's the challenge. The next step, I really think this was an awesome forum. Thank you for putting it together. Mike and Chairman Sumwalt, thank you. But I think we need to continue collaboration. FAA should continue collaboration with industry, GAMA, AOPA, EAA, all the other groups. And for us, FAA is to stay in front of policies that open the door to new ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I came into this board with ATP this and that and the other thing and 30 years of flying experience, 14,000 hours, whatever it was, and sat up on that podium behind you in a board meeting, and Debbie Hersman, who was our former chairman, had flown soloed on her 16th birthday, but didn't pursue it after that. And Debbie basically said what you just said, that we need a system. By the time you hear the stall warning, it's almost too late. And that's where we see people react the wrong way. And so her idea was we need something to back it up ahead of time, like the low energy warning system that Airbus has, speed, 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 or something to say if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to go off that cliff. So thank you very much. So we'll flip over here to Doug.
Well, for starters, thank you very much, Chairman Sumwalt and Mike, for inviting me to participate in this. I know you were a little worried about it. It's very interesting because a lot of what we're saying really goes back to those first 10 hours that a pilot spends with an instructor. When we think about the teachers of our children, who's the most important teacher? I think for my children, it was the kindergarten teacher. Because they brought in a thirst for learning, a thirst for knowledge in my children. We find that all our new instructors are just one step ahead of their learners. And so for me, for there to be an improvement, and I know Brad and I were speaking about this, if we can incentivize our new instructors to, even though they're eager to get on to the 1,500 hours and move to the cockpit, to understand that while they're sitting in the right seat, providing instruction, they have a very critical piece of responsibility in making the learner sitting in the left seat be a safe pilot. When I conduct practical tests, I can do CFI initials. My first question to the applicant is, what do you think your most important responsibility is? And I want to hear the answer: to create a safe pilot. We don't see that right now. We're not seeing it. I know it is part of SAFE's mission to do this. We've talked about mentoring. When SAFE was first put together, that was one of our precepts, was to have mentoring. We have lists of mentors that outnumber mentees by approximately 70 to 1. It's easy to find mentors. It's very difficult to find the young man or woman out of college thinking that they need a mentor now that they have their CFI. So just to instill that sense of professionalism in our early new instructors, I think will go a long way to making safer pilots.
Doug, thank you very much. Sean.
Well, I'd like to echo the thank you to you, Chairman Sumwalt, to you, Member Weiner, to Tim, to Mike, to the entire NTSB staff that are in this room today. If I remember right, I heard a statistic that I think it's upwards of half of your staff are active pilots and flying in GA on a regular basis. So what a wonderful team you've got here. Pilots by nature, I'm going to risk being generalizing here, but pilots by nature are social creatures and they're somewhat frugal. So as we look towards solutions on what can be the most impactful in this recreational, this hobbyist community that I talked about earlier today, we've got to make sure we keep those aspects in mind. As I said earlier, we've got to inspire. We have to educate, not regulate. We have to find ways that draw people to doing the right thing and pursuing the best practices and installing lower cost equipment into their cockpits versus mandate or drive by force. We've got great social networks out there. You know, EAA's got the chapter network. We've got the IMC clubs, the VMC clubs. Charlie mentioned that there's type clubs out there that many, many pilots are involved with. What a great way to create peer pressure and create inspiration to do things in a more professional way and aspire to be like those that you looked up to and admire. We have to continue to find solutions that follow that path. And then ultimately the biggest point I want to make is if you look around the room today, you look at this mix of industry and regulators, the FAA, academic, and the association world, working together is how we make the most progress and how we find the most effective solutions. Time and time again over the last several years we've demonstrated that. And it's encouraging. That's the way we should absolutely continue down that path, is to work together and find things that make our community better, because it's important for all of us. The health, the future growth of general aviation, it's all dependent on us, and I mean all of us together. Thank you.
Sean, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I think the biggest challenge is to find a good balance between technology and pilot training and pilot skills. So it will be interesting to see if we could create some kind of a reward system for pilots that is industry-run, industry-controlled, that it will reward pilots for additional training, additional ratings, additional education, at the same time as additional technology placed in the airplane, retrofitted in some cases into their older airplanes, maybe pilots that join an FDM system. They can get rewarded, and they need something in exchange, and that could be they could be using it for as a flight review, or maybe lowering insurance costs for aircraft. I mean, I think a reward system will be something interesting to explore.
Great thoughts.
Thank you, General Sumwalt. I'm actually very optimistic. I think we're on a good path. If we just go back this past decade, you know, the things that we've been working on,
FAA industry working together to update how we do primary flight training. That started around 2011, 2012, and we made progress. Really making a push on transition training to new aircraft. That is something that's happened this decade. Reforming how we certify aircraft, both new and old. That came out of a project right at the end of the last decade, 2009, 2010. A CPI study was called that the FAA launched. Again, we're just starting to see the benefits of that work, but that's addressing the aircraft. And then building on what Corey said, early this decade, we started really driving GA safety into a data-driven environment, both in the look-back approach, looking at accidents, what can we learn from them, and also in the GA and business aviation FOQA programs that are out there in voluntary reporting that are helping us all get on the same page. I think it's fair to say late last decade, we wouldn't have had a loss control forum. Everybody was all over the place talking about different safety issues. The data took us down the path that said during the first decade of the 2000s, 42% of fatal GA accidents involved loss control in flight, and we all stepped up and started working on that. So that three-legged stool, it gives me optimism for the future. So thank you for hosting this forum.
Jens, thank you very much. So we'll go to Brad.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to echo the thank you as well, and I personally am really excited about the young gentleman over there in the corner, and thank EAA and everybody else that put that together. Bring that to the forefront. It's incredibly insightful and really exciting to see. Kind of rejuvenates everybody's interest in aviation, I think. One of the things that I've heard so far is how everyone is looking forward to using their span of influence to reduce the general aviation fatality rate, to enhance aviation safety. How I look at it is in operational categories, because that's what the General Aviation Commercial Division does in the FAA. We are responsible for the operational aspects of GA, and to do that, we have to group things a little bit differently than what the GAJSC has done or what the NTSB has done. In that, the top couple killers in general aviation accidents is one, personal use, but the second one that's kind of near and dear to all of our hearts here is instruction, and that's actually on the rise. So I'm really intrigued by everybody's discussion here today, how we can reduce that instructional accidents down to zero. What can we do to get that down to nothing here in the next couple years? I think everybody has a piece of that puzzle, and it's very exciting to see everybody having this discussion. So thank you.
Brad, thank you for your participation. And Mel.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate being invited to this forum and for the participation of everybody here. I've learned a lot just listening to the discussion myself. I would just like to say that I feel like we're kind of at an inflection point in many ways. For a long time, we've had the similar kind of equipment with similar kinds of training. But as you look over the last decade, our accident rate has been decreasing. And I think that there's a lot of work that has been done and a lot of work that's yet to happen that's going to help influence that to the better as well. You know, the work that we do to try to help improve equipage and improve the availability of safety-enhancing technology is really exciting. And the example of today from Remora Systems is one example of that. So I feel very hopeful as we tackle this together. There's not one single silver bullet that gets it done, but I feel optimistic looking at the work that's being done that we can really reduce this loss control accident rate.
Thank you very much, Mel. And for AOPA, you can tell Mark Baker and Richard McSpadden that we made you all go last. But so Paul?
Yes, also thank you for this event today. Great discussions, and appreciate you having us all here. And thanks to the panelists as well for your engagement. A few things regarding the flight training community that I wanted to share, maybe encourage us all to consider going forward. Last year, ASI released a report on stall spin accidents, and one of the recommendations at the very back of the report was to incorporate more realistic stall spin scenarios into our flight training. speaking as a 20-year veteran of flight training now, I can look back at the days when I was taught how to do stalls from my instructor. I wasn't really taught how to do a stall correctly until my CFI check ride, and that was pretty embarrassing. Fortunately, the guy was gracious enough to pass me, but since that day forward, I've learned in a much better way how to teach power-off stalls. So I think we're seeing the needle moving in the right direction through all these discussions today, through technology, through training, changes to ACS, improvements in FAA publications, so on and so forth. But I still think there's a large portion of the flight training community of folks who were taught it one way years ago and need to be maybe retaught and how to do it more realistically going forward. And that would require all of us as a community of flight training instructors to mentor other instructors and us learn from others as well. I was talking to Patty this morning about stall recoveries and how instructors deal with that, because I've noticed in my own life that with student training is that when I first got my CFI years ago, I was younger, more ambitious, and I went out there and did stalls, no problem, let's go on next student. But as years went on, I did more and more stalls and more weird recoveries from students. It scared me. I'm now more apprehensive to do stall training. I didn't notice it. It's a very, very slow, slippery slope. I didn't notice it, and so Patty would recommend that CFI should pursue UPRT, and so I highly recommend that as well to help eliminate those fears and to get back into having a higher level of confidence with stall and spin recovery techniques and doing them properly. Lastly is the discussion about the stall warning horn. Perhaps by the time you hear it, it's too late. I would also submit that to support Sean's comments earlier and also Doug's is that perhaps in initial stages of primary training, we don't rely so heavily on instrumentation and technology. We teach more seat of the pants flying so you understand and feel what that pre-stall warning horn feels like and looks like and sounds like as far as the airplane, the wind going over the airfoils and the engine noise and so on and so forth. So consider that as well. And lastly, from an education standpoint, ASI has a lot of free education products, but we do welcome other content from everyone else as well. We have an initiative called Safety Alliance. So the only criteria is your product must be free, it must be online. So if you have anything that you'd like to share with our community, we can share through AOPA channels, please let me know. I'd be glad to put that online for you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And Justin.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me and everyone else here. I think this is a great forum and appreciate being involved. I guess I have the burden of going last here. I think a lot of good comments. I'm not sure I'm going to add anything new that hasn't already been said, but we'll echo a few different things. Number one, I think our biggest challenge is reaching the unreachables. I think there's always going to be that group of people who are going to be difficult to create a safety culture within them. I think it's going to be very tough, but I think as Corey said, we need to continue to move in the right direction. And I think that is sort of our next step. Continued next steps is really understanding what the data is telling us, where we're seeing problems, and continuing to improve. I know that the accident rate has significantly improved over the past 10 years or so, and we're making progress, and I think we need to continue to make progress. I think technology has played a big role into that. I look at everything from the policy, regulatory side of things, and obviously I think the changes that have occurred over the past several years have had a huge impact on the loss of control accidents, and I think collaborating both from a understanding the data standpoint and then addressing it, policies, regulations, fixing all of these things so that we can get technology into the aircrafts, which obviously I think have the biggest impact on safety. So again, I thank you for having me and everyone here, and appreciate you being involved.
Yes, thank you. And you're really not last after all. I will go last, but after we come down this row. But I want to ask two other important panelists, and that would be Justin and Thomas. Your thoughts on moving forward?
Sure. Okay. So I think I can give a two-part answer. I think is it on? Yep. Okay. So my two-part answer is. Firstly, this isn't really a loss of control thing, but just a general aviation thing. I think that young people are driven away from aviation unnecessarily in the sense that it might be a little too pricey these days. And I know it's hard to control that, but I think general aviation needs to be attractive to young people for it to sustain itself. Not necessarily like young people like people my age, but When I talk to my friends, they talk about drones a lot, but they don't talk about airplanes, and I think that we need to attack that. And then the second thing is, with the influx of technology, actually, Mr. Hennig, I was listening to your colleague's podcast with the Airplane Geeks recently, Mr. Bowles, one of the Airplane Geeks, and he talked about how this is the fastest moving period in aviation in a long time. And I think that from a regulatory perspective, it would be to our advantage as a general aviation community that we move quickly with regulation as well, which we have been, for the past 10 years. So, thank you.
Very, very insightful.
Yeah, and to build off of all the great points that Mrs. Wagstaff and all the other panel members have pointed out, to find a responsible role for cockpit technology in the overall pilot experience, right? Not to use technology as a crutch maybe to compensate for poor training, but rather to help already well-trained pilots make better informed decisions and overall build another generation of safe pilots. So we look forward to working with Mr. Walton and all the other amazing people who have reached out today to help make sure that happens. Thank you.
Thank you both. Member Weiner.
Well, just some thoughts. The comments have been very good. At the risk of sounding like a historian, back when I was a fresh flight instructor about a few years ago, it was power out of a stall, don't lose any altitude, without really realizing how close we were to spin conditions throughout that whole maneuver. About 30 years ago, when I first was charged with trying to get government and industry to work together, I was working for a major aluminum products manufacturer in the Seattle area. And it was very difficult to get the government folks, industry folks, and labor folks in the room at the same time. There was just a acknowledgement of separation. That's just one of those things we don't do. We have changed immensely since then. Back when Safer Skies first came out with the directive to reduce the number of commercial transport accidents by 80% in 10 years, we kind of all looked at each other and said, that's absurd, because we've been plateaued now for years, and this is as good as it's going to get. Of course, 10 years later, we had an 80+% reduction. That process that CAST used to do that, because I give CAST tremendous credit for that, involved collaboration between government, industry, and labor. Now, this same process we've inculcated in GAJSC. If we can do the same thing that we've been able to do with CAST, and I'm looking at Sean because Sean's the co-leader at this point, and the real challenge, it would be great to have the problem that CAST is having at the moment, and that is not having enough accidents to forensically determine what ought to be done. It's a high-class problem. In fact, not only CAST, but the NTSB is now spending more time on evaluating incidents, which frankly are what I call practice accidents. They just didn't quite make it to an accident, but they had the setup, and it's the setup that's important. So I appreciate everybody here being willing to spend a day in lovely Washington, D.C. after the cherry blossoms have faded. And we really expect to see great things happen with GAJSC. I can see it picking up momentum.
Member Weiner, thank you, and thank you for your leadership over the years. You put on a forum on loss control about 2 years ago, I guess. Is that right? Right here in this boardroom. So thank you for all you've done and continue to do. Thank you. Tim?
So thinking about challenges, especially for new technology, it reminds me my first airplane was a 1941 Piper J5A. And at the time, it didn't have shoulder harnesses. I really wanted shoulder harnesses. But there wasn't an STC for me to put shoulder harnesses in my airplane. And so I could have went the field approval route. Everybody knew that was a pain. And even as an AMP and IA, I couldn't do it. That always bothered me. And fortunately, the FAA fixed that problem. And now we can put those in there. Well, I look at the new technologies now that are available, and I remember the time that I had 2 airplanes in my garage. Yes, my wife was and still is a saint. But I had a certified airplane and an experimental airplane, and I looked at the technology that was available for experimentals, and so I went with a trio wing leveler. And not that I ever planned to fly IFR in that RV4, but I knew that all I had to do if I went inadvertent IMC was to hold a button for 3 seconds. It would level the wings and fly me the other way. I love that technology. Well, the thing is, I have a certified airplane now. I can't put that technology in. So AOPA, EAA, they've done a tremendous job of getting STCs to retrofit certified airplanes, vintage, older airplanes with that technology. And so every time that a news release comes out, they've got more airplanes added. I'm always looking, I'm excited, but my airplane hasn't been there yet. And so I guess my concern is eventually we've hit the high volume airplanes and it's going to stop. So I would encourage you all to keep working on solutions to make those new technologies available for every airplane.
Tim, thanks. Mike.
I want to thank all the panelists for taking time out of your busy lives to be here today, and I think the discussions were awesome. I definitely want to thank those who this is a side gig for and not necessarily in your line of normal work. Appreciate Patty, Charlie, and Doug for sure coming here for this. It's exciting, the technologies that are around the corner here or already in place. I think that's an awesome way to go. The challenge that I would throw out is the same challenge that we've talked about earlier, is professionalism, and how to get the recreational pilot to think like a professional. As I've worked accidents, I typically will see before a loss of control of the aircraft attitude, there's a loss of control of the mental attitude for pilots, right? And the big 3 that I typically see both military and civilian accidents is complacency, distractions, and pressing the envelope. And there's a lot of ways to press the envelope, right? Maintenance, like Charlie brought up, kind of taking that just a little too far on the maintenance, the weather, just a myriad of ways to press the envelope. And I think it's interesting that press the envelope came from The Right Stuff, an astronaut story, right? But those guys were pressing the envelope for a good reason, trying to get to space and so forth. Unfortunately, the recreational pilot tends to press the envelope for not such a good reason, and we see that a lot. So from a culture standpoint, I think the tendency when we teach is to teach about procedures and guidance and numbers and aircraft systems. And we've got the human factors piece of that, but flight instructors tend not to dig into that very much. Hey, this is how you're gonna feel like pressing the envelope for all these different reasons. And you have to restrict yourself from doing that. If you think about the movie Top Gun, everybody's seen Top Gun, right? The star was Maverick. Was Maverick professional? No, right? So that's the key, is to try to turn that needle. I think the more you can talk about it in training and try to spend a little bit more time on the human factors, the mental attitudes that go on, I think that would be helpful.